My name is Michael Aguilar. I'm the NASA Tech Fellow in software. I also work at the NESC, the NASA Engineering and Safety Center. About 2 years ago, there was a request. The NESC does assessments. We, in essence, were initiated due to the Challenger and Columbia accidents, as a matter of fact. There were findings in the reports after that accident that NASA needed to develop a third engineering arm that was not involved with programs and projects, that was independently funded, such that if you were making a decision about O-rings and the management wanted it to go one way and the engineering wanted it to go another way, we would be the third voice so that we could have a third vote in those kind of decisions. This was an assessment that was kicked off by the chief engineer. He felt there may be more risk in using some of these, what he called agile methods at the time. I changed the title to alternative, not to point the finger. And the idea was, he was concerned that he's heard all these stories about agile, and some of the stories he hears, they don't use requirements, and we're having trouble doing inside oversight and governance with these guys. So he started an assessment, and I wrote a paper on it, and the paper should be available to you if you're interested. This is supposed to be making sound, but it's not.
My dog's better because he gets kennel ration. My dog's better than yours. My dog's bigger than your dog. My dog's smarter than yours. My dog's better because he gets kennel ration. My dog.
I wanted the slide to kind of speak for itself. I have been through all of these wars in my lifetime, and when they come out, they're very emotional, somewhat almost spiritual or religious. For the most part, they're treated as revolutionary when the article comes out in a magazine or the new paperback. But in my experience, they've all been evolutionary. Ultimately, they get overtaken by the next best thing. And you find out, well, it wasn't the perfect silver bullet, but there's a lot of good things about it. So what I'd like to do is, I wanted to get away from the emotional, agile, waterfall kind of thing, and try to go into why it's happening. First of all, you can use them wrong. And if you want to go to the far extreme of using everything wrong, there's two examples here, and I might summarize it. All my slides, there's a lot of verbiage on these slides. I'm not going to go and quote them. But they were intended so that if somebody missed the meeting, they could actually go through these slides and get some reading out of it. There's an extreme programming expert, Bob, I forget his name, Bob Martin, who met somebody at an extreme programming symposium or exposition. And they were discussing how he's using this other person, this manager was using his extreme programming. And he went through several different questions and ultimately ended up, no, we're much better than that. We're not doing any documentation. Okay. On CMMI at the very bottom, which is an interesting example of how to do it wrong, there was a aerospace company that was very proud of a room that was filled with, I forget how many binders, but it was in the 100 of binders, of 2-inch binders, where they had met CMMI level 3 or 4, and those binders were just dust on the shelves, never looked at, but they had met their CMMI level 3 and 4. So you can mess up any of these. There's a history to them. The waterfall process, although it gets dinged a lot, the waterfall process is still going on every day, and in fact, every one of you is in the middle of it. If you build a house, you're building a waterfall process because an incrementally built house doesn't work out very well. Or a bridge, or buying a car, or deciding anything where you have to decide on requirements up front, what I want it for, I'm going to purchase it. No, I didn't want that one, I'm returning it and purchasing another one. No, I didn't want that one, I'm going to continue this cycle. You don't really get to do that. The real waterfall process is in contracts, budgets, and things that are built in hardware. You can't build a spacecraft over and over again trying out different things on an engine when the materials and the procurement and everything else is extremely expensive. So we're tied up. The hardware people are very much a waterfall environment. They have to be. Building a house, I'm building a house right now, and the money for the house gets released to the contractor at different phases of review cycles. As he meets some review, he gets more money, that kind of a thing. And that's exactly what a waterfall is. Now, you might think that these agile processes are brand new. But in essence, the Agile processes started out about 75 years ago. And they started out with NASA and some members of the Defense Department. And it was called, let me see if I can find it in here, Iterative and Incremental Design and Development, IIDD. And that grew into what you're seeing now as these agile developments. And NASA was one of the first ones to take it on. I'm going to come back to these slides. I was going to cover these slides in detail, but I think these would be the slides that would be very interesting for us to have a discussion at the end of the presentation. I'll just cover the highlights. Out of the paper I wrote, I came up with a whole bunch of attributes for different development environments or development problems. And then I picked about 8 of them to put on these slides. There is a real push toward the necessary documentation effort. Too much documentation takes too much effort, and it doesn't do you any good, it just sits on the shelf. Too little documentation doesn't meet your stakeholders' insight, oversight, and governance requirements. Architectural assessments. At one extreme, you don't really do an architectural assessment because you're working within an already defined API. You're building a website. It's a pretty defined architecture, has enough flexibility to do a very agile development. So the architecture itself is pretty much given to you and you work from there. Incremental planning and short development cycles. I don't know of any software development right now that doesn't do incremental planning and short development cycles. Short is a relative term. They can be as short as a month, short as several weeks, short as a couple of months, but they all do incremental development cycles. And why? The change to software means you rearrange your ones and zeros. The change to hardware means you have to procure another big chunk of titanium to go and mill. So the change to software does incremental development, it fits the software paradigm. Testing early and often, test-driven development. I really want to come back to this because I think this is one of the big strengths of Agile development, is putting testing up front and making it much more a definitive answer. And I think that you can, if you look at this test-driven development and the idea of stories and testing and the passing criteria that you work with in Agile, you can find requirements in there very easily. Incremental design, continuous integration, daily deployment, and root cause analysis. And I'll just concentrate on the last one. When you do small builds and you know you have small changes, root cause analysis is actually pretty darn easy. It didn't have the problem on the last build. It has the problem on this build. What's the code changes that we had? Let's go find what's really wrong with it. It's lousy to find that problem way down at integration and test when it's a big bang, and now you're looking through the entire code change. Artifact automation. This is another big piece, but it doesn't just go to Agile. I think Waterfall, any technique where you automate more of your artifacts, and the artifacts, I mean tables, documentation, PowerPoint slides. Most managers will budget software development based on the difficulty of the problem and maybe the count of lines, okay? But in essence, and then they expect the documentation to kind of happen in between all of that, like all the free time that you guys have, right? But I rarely see them say, and 10% of your time is going to be spent on developing automation processes that increase your productivity as we go downstream. Almost never mentioned in the budget. It's squeezed in sometimes. You usually do it on your own time. I really think that managers have to start looking at those 3 things to help efficiency is code, give you time for documentation and make that part of your job description, and give time to do automation, which you really never get time to do that. I think software does. A single code base, shared code, coding standards. Coding standards I might comment on. I'm pushing right now coding standards that can be checked by a static analysis tool suite. Checking coding standards or saying, yeah, we meet coding standards manually, it's bogus. You can't prove it, you can't verify it. But if you choose certain parts of a coding standard, you don't have to choose the whole MISRA coding standard, but if you choose certain things that you want to produce and then have a static analysis tool that verifies that, there's almost no effort to it. Teamwork, communication, customer involvement, engagement. I'll concentrate on customer involvement there. If you had a customer in your meetings right now who could say yes or no to certain code changes, instead of saying, well, I'll have to get back to you on that, we'll have a meeting next week, your entire development process speeds up simply because you have a customer in the process that can say yes and no to your changes right then and there. If you have that in Waterfall, it speeds up your Waterfall process or whatever other process. If you don't have that in your Agile process, it starts to grind that process to a halt because you don't get the customer involvement, you can't get those meetings finished. This is the presentation. When I used to work on JWST, we were using the Rational Unified Process and generating the entire set of code for the ISM, the Instrument Service Module, which is where all the instrumentation code was, not the spacecraft code, but the instrument code, the telescope. And we were actually generating code with a case tool, 100% generated code for that particular system. And we had no trouble doing that because we didn't necessarily tell anybody. If they looked at this particular diagram, at the very top, they were real happy. There was their milestones, and it looked like a waterfall, okay? And we could meet those milestones, and we planned to meet those milestones, and we planned to actually do PowerPoint slides and do the whole show. In fact, in some of our milestones, we simply projected the model on the screen, forgot the PowerPoint slides because we were talking to software people. But as you move down, you see the stair-stepping case. And what it was is we did a build, and then we did the verification of that build while we started the next build, and then we verified that build when we started the next build. And this was the RUP process. It doesn't meet some of the Agile processes, which would argue that you need to finish your verification before you start the next build, but this was much more efficient with the kind of test beds we had. And there's no problem with staggering them like that as long as you know that's the problem you're trying to solve and you put it in your process, which we did. In fact, the very last build is a cleanup build, knowing that because of the staggering, certain things would be left off at the end. So the very last build was going to be just fixing up those stragglers in debugging and doing tests before we could do integration. The way we got code generation done is we did all the tests we would normally do if we hand-made the code with static analysis, inspections, and the verification testing, so that we had the machine write the code, but we went through all the verification tests that everybody else was very comfortable with. We didn't do anything special there. This was real easy to communicate. Now, when I go to this one, now please forgive me, I'm not going to bash anybody. This is the only Agile picture I have ever seen, okay? Every mission uses some pieces of this Agile picture that they download off of Mountain Goat, and they say, this is what we're doing. And what's interesting is everybody thinks they're giving you a nice picture, but many of us that review all the missions, we keep seeing this darn picture. And we start to wonder, do they really know what they're doing? It's the same picture, okay? And and it causes more questions and more concerns. It looks so much more complex than they're capable of understanding. And to me, it really doesn't tell you what you're doing. If you left all of that as like the Wizard of Oz, leave that behind the curtain, and tell them, yeah, we're going to meet your milestones, here's our delivery dates, we're going to give you all this good code, okay? How are you verifying it? Well, this is how we're verifying it, okay? I think you'll get a lot less pushback because this actually confuses people and makes them feel that there's more risk in doing this Agile development, and if there's more risk in it, they get me writing these papers. There's a comment out there that Agile's never really been used on very critical, safety-critical, critical type missions. And I dug around because I wanted to find an example. I looked in medical, electronics, et cetera, and I stumbled across this, and I've never seen it. There's a lot of documentation on this. The Aegis missile cruiser uses computers to control Gatling guns and rockets and everything else to blow stuff out of the air when they're being attacked, and they use this ship to protect aircraft carriers. And it automates the radar signatures as to how they're going to attack different threats. When you're out cruising around and you find that your enemy has now developed a way of using some kind of electronic subterfuge or whatever, and it blocks one of your signals, it would take them, and I'm reading this, it would take them 8 to 10 years to make a software change to work on that threat, okay? Because they were working this big monolithic software problem. So they went out and studied a bank, and I believe it was some kind of a stock, company, on how they did Agile. So here's the Department of Defense with the Aegis missile cruiser looking at some bank and figuring out how they did Agile. And what they came up with was, we'll modify the process. And the previous slide I showed had something in the title called Water Scrum Fall, okay? Which is waterfall up front, do your Scrum software in the middle, but you deliver it the same way. You've got to meet contract and other obligations. And that's kind of what they did with this one. They spent a lot of time doing an architectural analysis, and they built a very rigid architecture. What we did with CFE, CFS took, what, 12 years, something like that. But now it's a real flexible architecture where you can add apps to it constantly because the API is pretty stable. They built the software so that the missile cruiser could handle a very fixed architecture, and then they had programmers writing the apps that would plug into this architecture depending on the threat they had. And they would actually write some of these apps ahead of time. What if we had to do this? What if we saw this threat? And they built a library of all these little apps. So they've got an Aegis missile cruiser app store, okay? And they download the apps depending on the threat. They were able to build these apps now in about 1 month turnaround. So it's, you can understand, they're very rigid up to the architecturing that they needed, and then they let the Agile development happen within the software to develop the apps for the Aegis missile cruiser. Very interesting article, there's a lot of it out there. I'm gonna do, there's 3 more slides and then we'll have some discussion. Here's process improvements. No matter what software you're doing, some of the more agile methods promote these as their, in essence, basis or manifesto. They could be applied to any software any of you are doing right now, okay? The one thing I think is missing many times is when you jump into Agile, you don't perform some kind of trade study. What are the risks I'm taking on by taking on this new Agile technique for a mission this size that has never been done before, and I have to figure out all the interfaces to still get this waterfall requirements fitting into my Agile and allow inside oversight and governance? Do I have to do training? One of the things we found in JWST is we lost half of our programmers. They didn't want to use a tool. They wanted to program straight in C like they'd always done. They went and found other programs to go work on, okay? Find and leverage those customer representatives that can actually make authority decisions on the spot. That'll speed up your process no matter what you're doing. Prioritize and invest in automation whenever you can, and that needs to actually be in your budget. Maybe there's some software guys that's all they are, is toolsmiths and automation smiths to support the team. Now, apply lessons learned to requirements design development. This is kind of interesting. In many of the books you read on Agile, they will say start minimally and only add what you need to if you need to add it, right? Which it sometimes, to me, sounds like ignore all the lessons learned. We'll learn those lessons again, okay? And NASA comes across sometimes as a bureaucracy only because we have so many lessons learned. We have seen all the failures, and they're very subtle failures at times. And it seems that some of the new commercial partners are relearning some of these lessons where they could apply a little bit of them up front. And then the support documentation. You need the documentation, but make it realistic. Make it such that there's documentation that you use in-house for your own turnover, for your own education for new hires, that describe the information, but leverage the software code. Most management and whatever won't let you use the code as a document set, but I disagree wholeheartedly. It is the most dynamic and most accurate document set you've got, and if you leverage that, such that saying, no, we're going to write a 20-page document that gives you the overall architecture and schema of the system, and then lay the code out with all the comments in it, and you're done. And I will fight for that if you have problems on that. This is an interesting one. I like this. I bumped into a guy on the web who said, you know, one of the problems with Agile is they all treat the manifesto like the Constitution or something, that it can't be changed. It's the Bible. And his comment was, you should go in there and write your own manifesto. If you have a project that has crude, safety, criticality, whatever, or needs to meet a certain standard or something like this, just grab their manifesto and say, you know, we need to add to this piece of that manifesto so that it includes safety, or it includes this standard, or it includes this coding standard. And he went and did an example here on safety critical code. He took the original manifesto and just added some lines to it saying this is what we really think our manifesto is. In the Rational Unified process, that was called your vision document, okay? But I thought that was a real simple way to make all those little tiny gaps in their manifesto get filled in for software that we do, that have crude robotics, radiation, survivability, etc. And then this other part, in the back of the document I wrote a very large questionnaire, which was what do you have to watch out for in your particular states? Like I've got development plan, requirements, etc. And I've got a sample here, and what it amounts to is I've worked in software development where the software development plan was a contract. You wrote that, and then you had to develop exactly that way, and they were putting check marks saying, do you doing this, are you doing this, are you doing this? I've worked in other groups where the software development plan was dynamic. As things didn't work or we optimized CM processes and whatever, we just rewrote the process, okay? You have to be aware of how that works with Agile, because you want to be Agile. There may be a part of the document that you agree you will never change, the interfaces to your V&V and things like that. But you maybe get an agreement so that the rest of the document is up to you, that you can change that dynamically to describe a different set of tools, a different compiler, a different way of doing something as you develop, so that you can be an Agile, but you can also meet the contractual obligations. That's the end of this. I'm going to go back to those other slides just to get you guys interested in asking questions. Is there any questions, comments, anything you want to add?
I have a question. So these great lessons that you kept.
Yeah.
So the lessons you captured, can we get a look at?
This entire document should be available. I'm going to see if I can make it available, and we'll put it up on the website with all the presentations.
Excellent.
And then everybody can just have the whole meet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, we got one back here.
Okay.
There's a little bit at cross purposes because we have some aerospace folks here and we have some NASA folks here. So,
is that mic on?
hello?
Yeah, there you go.
Right,
you got it.
So on the more tactical side of our government space missions, aerospace provides a lot of guidance and oversight, and there are some very rigid documents regarding software engineering process and deliverable and those types of things. So I guess I'm kind of wondering kind of the interplay between NASA and the aerospace side. Is there any dialogue there to take some of these things? You're saying a lot of things I believe to be true.
Yeah, I
apply that to the other
I
side
think
of
you
the
can
world.
apply that to Aero. I worked on an Aero project. You have to understand, a lot of Aero stuff that we do software for is all prototypes and experimentation, different wing controls, et cetera, et cetera. On that side, that's a couple of programs I've worked like that, and they wanted to use Agile for their code development because they didn't get the experimental aircraft for very long, and they wanted to run several different tests during a particular day. But to do that, they had to meet all these other requirements of safety and everything like this, and we came up with a way where they could still meet the safety requirements, but make code changes that rapidly each day. So, and that, if you think about it, you need to come up with a process, because if in that particular example, they didn't have the plane very long. This was important avionics control system. They didn't want to have to go through all those review cycles every time they made a change. This was a prototype. So to support an efficient research effort, okay, they came up with a process and a plan to do the software this way. And it isn't, you're not really, I don't think of it as Agile, Waterfall, or whatever. You manage to build a process of developing code that meets the problem set that you're dealing with. And it takes some pieces of Agile and some pieces of Waterfall and some pieces of overview and standards and particular document sets that are rigid. Now, I'm also saying that In some cases where all the documents are really rigid like this, then you have to obey that rule, and Agile doesn't work in that very well. A lot of requirements up front in that kind of environment. And you just do it. But Agile does have a place where, and what's interesting is at some point in that, even that rigid plan, there's a cycle of developers who are writing in a very agile manner. It's just the way code is. It's easy and flexible to change. Yep, exactly. Well, I've always liked the term wetware to explain all the problems you have with management. You know.
Other questions? No? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mike. Actually, at Aerospace, one of the problems we see when contractors try Agile the first time is they let too many defects go too long. Actually, I wanted to talk about that. Oh, here.
There was one thing, a point I wanted to make. One of the big criticisms that I've heard, this is much better. One of the criticisms you hear is Agile doesn't really have requirements. I mean, that bothers everybody. But if you really look at your stories, and if you're running your stories inside of some kind of a story capturing tool suite, and you're doing your test development up front, and you're defining the tests, and then you define the criteria. If you read that criteria that you have, that's your requirements. You put shall statements in your criteria, and you've got your requirements. And it goes to filling in that gap that a lot of people criticize, saying you don't have requirements. That's not true. You have requirements in your testing, in the criteria for passing. That's your shall statements. And you should be able to sell that to somebody that says you don't have requirements. Okay?
That's a good way to look at it. Thank you. I'm going to take that home.